The new Harder and Steenbeck Infinity 2024 is finally here with our radical new titanium nozzle system. Hi, I'm Warrick, and I'm so happy to be here today to make this video to tell you about what our goals are for the Infinity 2024 and what we hope it will bring to your creative process. We wanted to bring you an airbrush that will give you detail like you've never dreamt of before, so that you can take your artistic vision and realize it in full fidelity to share it with all the rest of us. We wanted to make it easy to live with whilst being the finest airbrush that we've ever made. We felt that to do that, we had to rewrite the book on materials that have previously been used in airbrush manufacture. We also wanted to give you something that had a trigger feel that kind of almost took the airbrush out of the process, where you feel like you've just got the relationship with the paint and you're not thinking about the tool in your hand. We wanted to try to really unfetter your creative process as much as we could. We've done that by looking into Eastern medicine and yoga, looking at the technology of what materials to use. We've looked at the ergonomics of how you interact with a paintbrush and a pencil, because these are things that are intuitive to all of us, because of course we start learning to write and paint way before we get in contact with our first airbrush. We've tried to go right back to first principles, and whilst the look of the airbrush, as you see it with the beautiful chrome and the gold and the red that you're used to seeing on the Infinity, that is an iterative design. Everything else on this airbrush, we've distilled it right back down to first principles. What are we trying to accomplish? And we've tried to unlock ourselves from previous directions and design decisions and just try to do everything in the service of that goal of unlocking your vision, so that you can put it out to the world in perfect fidelity, so that when you as an artist look at it, can say, yes, this is exactly what I wanted to paint. Now, it's long been a belief of mine when I look at the history of the airbrush business, that the great leaps that were made in terms of the popularity of a brand or an airbrush that became a seminal bestseller, it was always because the people that made that airbrush started with the front end first. There's no point to an airbrush. Doesn't matter what you do behind the front end. There is no point to it if you don't have a front end that does something remarkable with the paint. Now, we've got three different airbrushes in our line. We've got the Ultra, the Evo, and the Infinity, and we're looking for something slightly different in the character from each of them. With the first two, we're looking for a really friendly feel, something that opens up relatively softly on the trigger. It's very easy to learn detail. And then when we pull the trigger back, we're looking for something that's going to give us this nice wide coverage so that we can do a lot of different types of work with it. With the Infinity, we're looking for something a little bit different. Will it do background coverage? Of course it will, absolutely. But the challenge that we set ourselves was, can we make a front end that not only gives you unbelievable detail when you're very close, and by very close I mean 1 millimeter away, but we wanted to try to accomplish something that a lot of artists have asked us for, which is what we call standoff detail. Now, standoff detail is when you're a little bit further back, maybe 5 millimeters or something like this, but you still have a very focused spray, a very fine line. The reason why this is super important, if we look at an artist, if they're trying to work with hair and texture and this kind of details, it's easier to make a flowing organic shape if you're not so locked in to the surface that you're painting on. If you've got a little bit of standoff to be able to use your wrist and have a more fluid movement in the shapes that you make when you're painting. For somebody who's working on a model or a miniature or a fantasy miniature, for example, standoff detail is important, because sometimes you've got to paint into recesses and you can't get super close to the point you want to paint. The easiest example to think of course, is a recessed eye socket that's inside a helmet. You can't get super close to that. You're going to be 2 and 3 millimeters away. And what we tried to give you with this airbrush is the ability to deliver incredible detail whilst not being almost in contact. The way it realizes is that when you are super close, you're going to get lines that are so sharp that you'll struggle to believe that they came from an airbrush. When you come away the first 3, 4, 5 millimeters, the line doesn't expand that much, but it becomes slightly diffuse, so more like a normal airbrush line. And this, we think, is something that's really going to revolutionize the way that you can paint detail. So we're super excited to share that with you. The biggest performance differentiator in how you make an airbrush go fine is how thin you can make the wall of the nozzle. Now, of course, the big problem with that is when you go really thin, then you end up with nozzles that are about as durable as if they're made out of paper. And so we did all this experimentation with our standard nozzle material, And we found that we could make beautiful nozzles that performed amazingly well, but you almost just breathe on them and then they're non-functional. So we had to find a material that would enable us to get down to these phenomenally fine wall thicknesses. And when I say small, I'm talking about 0.04 of a millimeter, the thickness of the nozzle wall at the mouth. It's incredibly, incredibly fine. To do that, there's really only one material that you can consider, and that is titanium. And the reason why titanium is so suitable is because not only is titanium extremely strong and extremely hard, but it has an ever such a slight amount of elasticity to it. This is why it's so widely used in aerospace, is because it's a very, very forgiving material when it's under load. And so what we've done is we brought titanium into our process in the factory, and then we had to learn how to not only machine it, but machine it into a part that's finer than any part we've ever made before. We've been working on this for a little over 2 years now, on this nozzle design with this material. In that 2 years, we have iterations where we'll put something on the machine, we'll try to machine it, and we'll learn something. It won't be finished, but we'll have some new information, and we need to go away, do some more work on the tooling or the design, and then come back to the machine. Now, the machine that we've been using to do this machine, the time that we've had off this machine in the last 2 years is effectively 3.5 months, where it's done nothing other than produce prototype concepts for this titanium nozzle system. And so it's been an incredibly rewarding, yet at times frustrating piece of work that we've done. And so for that, I really want to pay tribute to the team at the factory, not only the people who've been involved with making the nozzle prototypes, but the whole team who's been involved in getting the Infinity to the stage it's at now, because we've really, really pushed our envelope in every way that we possibly could. And my team has been behind the project every step of the way. Everybody's been frustrated at some point or another. Everybody's felt a little bit of despair at some time or another. But the great thing here at Harder & Steenbeck is my team always supports each other, and they always focus on what our goal is, which is to deliver something to you that enables you to realize your artistic vision. The next topic that I want to get into, which is so cool, I absolutely love this, is you might remember back at the start of April, we released a video on YouTube asking for your feedback on certain design elements that we were considering for the Infinity 2024. Now, we're sorry it took us a little bit longer to make this one after that one, but I'm confident that once you get your airbrush, you're going to be okay with the weight. Now, we asked you for your feedback on what you thought you needed from the airbrush, and I'd like to just take you through some of the responses that we had, because we've been able to implement all of them. So one of the things that many of you said, actually it was 32% of our respondents said that they wanted to be closer to the surface. Now this we already knew. So this fits in completely with our goal of trying to reproduce the ergonomics and the feel of a paintbrush or a pencil. And the key thing to that is that you've got to be closer to the surface. There's two elements to it. It's that is one. And then the other one, which amazingly was also a feedback item that we got from you, and we had 11% of people talked about this, so this is a little bit more of a refined point, but still significant, is to have the airbrush being a little bit longer in the back end, so that when you hold it, it's guaranteed for all sizes of hands to rest on the crook of your hand like this. And again, this is a really key part of the feel of a paintbrush. So we've implemented that. So you'll notice the proportions of the airbrush, it's much shorter in the front and much longer at the back. And this really speaks to the ergonomics of a paintbrush. The other things that came out in this survey that we did with you is you talked about weight. We had 28% of you talk about wanting an airbrush that was a little bit lighter. We agree with this completely. We know that there's two things. We know that when you want to paint for a long time and you want fluidity with your strokes, you want something that doesn't weigh quite so much as a traditional airbrush. And so what we've done with this one is the weight of the new Infinity is kind of halfway in between the old Infinity and the aluminium airbrush, the AL+. And I think that's a beautiful compromise. It's slightly more biased to the weight of the old one, but it is in the middle there. So thanks for that feedback. We agreed with that completely. We were already developing in that direction. It was so great to get that feedback from you, to know that we were all on the same page. The other thing that people talked about a lot was the cup sizes. Almost everybody came back and said that they thought for this airbrush, the 5 ml cup was bigger than what was needed. We agree with that. One of the constraints that the 5 ml cup puts on us from airbrush design is it means that we can't shorten the front end as much as we'd like. So what we've done is we've developed this rather lovely 4 ml cup. Okay, and this one sits, I'm going to say, about 60% of the way in between the 2 ml and the old 5. It's very, very practical. I don't think anybody who needs a detail airbrush needs anything bigger than this, but this is now the big cup for the Infinity. So it's substantially smaller than the 5 ml. You can still fit the 5 ml if you really want to, but we supply the 2-in-1 with the new 4 ml. The other cup, which we actually didn't have on our radar at all, but we had 31% of you asked us to develop a cup that sat in between our micro cup and the 2 ml cup. And here we have it. And that is this little cup here. It doesn't come with a lid because it's so small, but this is probably about a 1.2 cc capacity, and it's a beautiful, beautiful little cup. It casts almost no shadow on the work, makes the front end of the airbrush feel very, very light. It's big enough to be easy to use, and it's so great to use. It's beautifully polished on the inside, cleans up super, super fast because it's such a small cup. You're going to be cycling through colors fairly quickly. We're really proud of that one, and we're putting that in with every airbrush. So even the Solo will get that one as well as the 2 ml. We had a limited amount of feedback on this one, but it's still important, I think. People asking, I'd like to be able to customize the feel of the airbrush in my hand from the perspective of weight. Now, at Harder and Steenbeck, we know about this because we've always had the aluminium airbrush and the regular airbrush, and it's been polarizing. Some people love the lighter weight, some people like the heavier. So what we're going to be offering as an accessory with this airbrush in the very, very near future is the ability to buy end pieces, handles, which are differently weighted. So if you think that you want a bit more feel on the back part of your hand here where the airbrush sits in, we're going to give you options for that. And I think that's pretty cool. Really happy to be able to give solutions to people so they can construct the tool that's really perfect for them. So that is coming soon. A lot of people talked about the FPC valve. That will be available as an accessory for the Infinity. Please buy the 2024 version because it's been optimized for more flow and better overall control. And then the last thing that was talked about a lot, and I think we had 17% of all respondents talked about this, is this desire for a narrower spray cone. And this is where we came into the standoff detail concept. And this was something that we were already working on. It's quite an abstract concept, so it was amazing to see so many of you talking about that in the comments of that feedback video. So I'm really pleased to tell you that many of the things you talked about there, we were already on the same page as you and implementing it already in the design. And then there was a couple of things that we didn't expect, and we've been able to implement both of those into what's going to come in your box when you buy one of these remarkable new airbrushes. The topic I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, you know me, that I'd like to talk a lot about now, is what we at H&S think about as the artistic interface. So this is the points of contact that you have with the airbrush and how that can affect your ability to realize your creative vision. Now, the first one that we think about, the most important one, is this pad here, your forefinger, the thing that really gives you the creative control over most of what the airbrush is going to do. So we think a lot about this interface of your forefinger pad with the airbrush. I know some of you paint with your thumb or even your middle finger. By the way, Geiger painted with his thumb, so nothing wrong with doing that. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for anybody, that's for certain. But we think a lot about how the airbrush interacts with your body. Now, there's a couple of things to this. When we did a lot of market survey on a lot of different painters, what we found out was that beginners want a trigger that has a fair amount of feedback into their finger. They also want something that doesn't open up too fast because it feels intimidating and surprising when they first start painting with the airbrush. People who are sort of in the middle of their progression want something that's in the middle. You know, it's quite sensitive, but not overly so. But then when we get to people who are really trying to push their painting to the next level, what we found is that they want a trigger that's more responsive at the front. Not too much, but enough that when you're doing fine detail, you're using single joint movements on your finger. As soon as you start to have to involve the second joint, so if you look at my finger here, as soon as this second joint starts to move, then you're losing a little bit of resolution, a little bit of control. So we want to think about being able to just move this one. The way that we do that is something that we can really take control of here at H&S, and that is because we have this wonderful, wonderful part of the airbrush called the accenter. That's this semicircular thing that sits behind the trigger. Now, what we've been able to do with that in the 2024 iterations, because we've completely taken control of that part, there's no slop or play in the movement of that at all. We can now govern the shape of that where it impacts the needle guide so that each airbrush has a different character. I love this part of what we've done with this airbrush. The Infinity 2024 will start to open up and give you a response with paint very, very, very early on in the movement. And this is something that people who want to have very fine control really love, because it's a really responsive airbrush that you can really get to know and have a precise feeling for tiny amounts of paint. And it always delivers. It's right there. So we really love that development for that. Allied to that, now you've got to think about, if you've got more responsiveness from the airbrush, you must have an interface with your finger where you can perceive that movement to the absolute highest possible level. And so for that, we looked into some Eastern practices, and specifically we thought about yoga mats. You know these spiky mats that you lie on when you're looking to kind of relax and center yourself? I use them sometimes when I've had a little bit of a hard day and I just want to try to relax. The thing about these that I noticed was that when you lie on them and you're breathing, just your breath, you can feel every movement in your skin as you lie on these spiky mats. And I thought, well, hey, why not bring this into the trigger? Now, it's not a spiky trigger, but if you look at the top of these, you'll see that it's textured in a way so that your interface with the trigger is through a series of raised bumps. Now, what this does is when you move your finger on that trigger, because you have all these little stand-ups slightly pressing into your forefinger pad, you perceive every movement. So every little movement that you put on your finger, you feel what the trigger's doing. You have complete, intimate knowledge of it to the point where it kind of disappears and you have a relationship more with what you're trying to do with the paint and less with thinking about your trigger. So we call this our acupressure trigger, and we absolutely love the way this has gone down with our artists who've been testing this airbrush with us, because it seems to deliver an intuitive nature to the finest of the fine strokes that we need to do when we're trying to push our painting to another level. The other thing that we focus on is we've looked at this new stroke that's really developed, I think, in the miniature painting community actually, where we're building detail with these little ups and downs on the trigger. Bump, 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 bump. This is something that's developed in the miniature painting community, and it's used to slowly build a hue on a very, very small part of a model. That stroke is somewhat complex if you have to go down and back, down and back, down and back. So we thought about that, and our solution to that, normally airbrush triggers, the lever comes up, and that's on one axis, and then the button on the top of the lever is centered in the same axis. Not on the Infinity. We've moved the center of the button way, way back, so that you've got a trigger that has far less real estate in front of the lever and far more behind. And so when you want to make those little tap tap strokes, if you want to have the airbrush open up and give a little bit of color every time you just press down, what you do is you get on the back of the trigger, okay? And because you're pressing down so far behind where the center of the lever is, just pressing it down gives you the small rock back on the needle. And every time you press down, you get a little bit of paint, a little bit of paint, a little bit of paint. And this gives you phenomenal control in being able to build a little patch of color to the precise hue that you want. And you can do it on multiple strokes. You can build, 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 make a decision, okay, I'm done. Rather than the more traditional kind of airbrush thing where it's like total stress of one stroke, will it be too much or will it be okay? So now we're just touching it several times and going, now it's good. I'm going to come back to something that I spoke about already in the video, but I just really love this so much. I want to kind of mention it again. We're really, really happy with how we've tried to approximate the ergonomics of a paintbrush. So for those of you who are virtuosos with the paintbrush, but maybe not so much with the airbrush or even totally new to it, we think that when you pick this airbrush up, you're going to feel really at home with the relationship of where your hand is relative to the surface that you're trying to paint, this pressure in the crook of your hand from this much, much longer back end, but your proximity to the work with this much shorter front end. It's really got an intuitive feel that brings you much more into the headspace of feeling like you're writing or feeling like you're using a paintbrush. So we're super excited about that ergonomic change that we've given you with this airbrush. Now I'm going to start taking the airbrush apart, and as I do it, I'm just going to talk you through what we find in there. So the first thing that I think I want to talk a little bit about is what we call the quick fix. This is the needle limiter that you find at the back of all Infinities. Now, we didn't change this at all. We did take the numbers off because we don't think they're particularly relevant, and the settings that you want to use are completely infinite anyway. This was perfectly designed by my predecessor, Jens Mattheson, and so I haven't changed it even one bit. But a lot of you don't understand the purpose of it, and I think it's super, super useful even to high-level painters. Here's how it works. You push the button in, and you can then screw it in to limit the needle to whatever throw you want. So let's say we want to have a really small trigger throw like this. Just for some work we want to do, we want that little bit of assistance. When you paint with very, very small trigger movements, sometimes you get a bit of tip dry. And what you'd love to be able to do is just to pull the trigger back, send some wet paint out over that needle tip, and clean off that little bit of tip dry. But you can't do it with a needle limiter. But with a quick fix, you can. You just pull that back. You've now got full trigger moving back, bom, 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 clean your tip, push it back in, and it goes right back to your setting. So think of it as a memory setting. It's super, super useful. Now, let's get the end piece off and start digging around inside this thing. The first thing that we see is this needle chuck that we pioneered on the Ultra and the Evolution, and the purpose is exactly the same. And so what it's designed to do is that when you put in the needles in from the back, you can put them in on quite an angle, and the shape inside that part guides that needle in so that you really can't bump the tip on anything on the way in. Once it's in the needle chuck, it's perfectly centered because of its length, and it's going to guide perfectly through the center of the airbrush and not bump anything on the way through there. So we really like this revised needle chuck design. And here we see the next part, which is the tension adjuster. Now what this does is it gives you the ability to totally customize the feel of your trigger. You can back it right off so that you've got a very, very, very low spring back on the trigger. If you're the type of painter who wants a bit more push and a bit more feedback, you can screw it right in, and now you've got a much, much firmer trigger. So that really gives you the ability to customize it for exactly what you want. Now, what's really interesting is I've actually had painters write to me and say, I really like the feature because it does two things for me. One, when I'm painting a lot of work and I'm getting through a lot of stuff, I want a trigger that's really free, really loose, not tiring at all. When I'm doing very fine detail, I want something that gives me a little bit more back pressure, a little bit more feedback, and so they want to be able to adjust it in. And on the Infinity, you can do that with this feature. If we then remove that part, now what we're going to see is the needle spring and the needle guide. Now, this is a beautiful part. I really love it. This has our lubricant storage concept on it with these rifles. And what these little rifles are designed to do is if you lube the airbrush up, it will retain some lubricant in these grooves and it releases it as the airbrush needs it. So the bearing surfaces are kept always lubricated, and you've got a nice store of lubricant in there. And it does two things. One, it makes the airbrush feel super, super smooth. The other thing that it does is, of course, if you ever get any atomized paint falling in through the trigger slot while you're painting and billowing your beautiful color everywhere, you might get a bit of paint coming in the back end, and it'll never stick because you've always got lubricant available there. So we love it for that. Coming a little further forward, we come to this trigger. We've executed the same lubricant tank concept on the trigger shaft here, where the accenter slides up and down. There's a little teardrop in there. We'd like you to pop a little dot of lube in there as well when you start a painting session, and it will just keep everything moving like butter all the way through the painting session. The trigger itself, I think it's one of the most, I don't think it is the most complex part that we've ever machined. We make the trigger itself out of one piece. There's no parts pressed into each other. And what that gives us is this phenomenal rigidity of the part. And that's really important because what it means is that the feel is perfect. There's no flex, there's no play, there's no movement. It's just super, super direct. We've also got these wastes that are cut into it here. And this is part of the quick clean function. And it gives us an extra 0.8 millimeter of needle movement so that when we want to clear the airbrush, we can get that needle right back and just dump the color out of it super fast. All of the shapes on the bottom half of the trigger on the Infinity have been completely redesigned. I don't want to talk too much about that because there's a little bit of secrecy in what that does, but it's something that really contributes to the beautiful smoothness at the start of the trigger pull. So there's some fairly radical changes that have happened here, and you'll see that in the shapes when you strip this airbrush. The air valve is relatively similar to what we had before, but we have optimized the 2024 air valves in general to flow a little bit more air, to be a little bit more optimized when you've got direction changes so that you get a more consistent flow of very smooth air coming up to the front of the brush, and it is important. Coming up to the head, I just love what we've been able to do with these heads. The flow optimization, you'll see all different shapes with these nozzles now, completely different to what you're used to from us. Very, very radical concept. And the idea is to get the airflow as close to the core, to the center of the nozzle as absolutely possible. What we're trying to do there is to help us with this limited divergence as we come out the front of the airbrush to get this standoff detail concept realized. The needle cap has been reinterpreted as well to sit within our Harder and Steenbeck head concept of you can see the needle tip, you can clean the needle tip, but it's always protected. But on the Infinity, it's interpreted to give you minimal protection, but maximal access. So you'll see that it's much more cut away than the Evolution, and it gives you great visibility when you're working over your work. The final thing I want to say about these heads, the shape of the air cap. Now, I'm very fortunate to have some really, really clever friends. And one of my friends has worked for some time in F1 aerodynamics, and he explained the Coanda effect to me. And we've actually exploited that on the front of these airbrushes. You'll see a very, very different shape on the front of these air caps, on the external shapes. And this is partly because we're exploiting something called the Coanda effect on the external shapes of these air caps to help us limit the spread as it comes out the front of the airbrush. So a shape here that we've created is helping us to keep that spray pattern tight for a little bit further away before it spreads out to give us the background coverage that we all want from an airbrush nozzle when we're a little bit stood away from the work at 20 or 30 millimeters. And so now I thought it would be fun to show you the other aspect to our engineering, which is that it's all too easy to get carried away with how great this part is and how cool that part is and how wonderful this performance is, and forget that really none of our artists are in airbrushing because they want to be airbrush mechanics. They're all in it because they want to paint. Okay? One of my great artist friends said to me that the reason why he uses Harder and Steenbeck is because all airbrushes need a bit of maintenance at some point or another, but Harder and Steenbeck, it's easier and faster to do it on them than it is with any other airbrush. And I really love that about our products, and we've really tried to maintain that on the Infinity. So I'm going to chat to you while I'm putting this back together. So let's put the front end on. So as per usual with H&S, you just slip the nozzle into the air cap. It's got a new device at the front of the nozzle that really helps them to be perfectly centered, but it's still just as easy, just drop it in. You screw that in, tighten it up, it's done. The trigger we've optimized again with this accenter that cannot rotate around the shaft. So again, it's just a super simple drop in. It's very clear which way is forward and which way is back. That's done. You then pick up your needle guide, and that just slips in the back there like that. You turn it and it will lock into the accenter. Needle spring goes on the back. Needle tension adjuster screws on from there. All of our threads have a lead on them, which means that it's almost impossible to cross them. That's a little engineering detail that we think really makes a difference in terms of your day-to-day life with our airbrushes. Needle chuck goes on, you go to tighten it up, and then you back it off by like 1/8 of a turn, and then you can pick the needle up. Obviously use the design of that chuck to just wham it in there without any care at all, because it is always self-centering. And then the needle cap can just be pushed on the front of the airbrush. That's on, and then of course the last piece, we just put on that end piece, tighten that up, whether you like to paint with it in the horizontal position or the vertical, not a problem either way. It's braked by an O-ring, so it's always firmly in position, whichever end point you want to screw it up to. Now, I've talked a lot about the airbrush, but really the most exciting thing about this whole project is when we put it out there to you, our artistic community, and you create things with it that we could never have imagined. So we're super excited to release this to you, and what we'd love to have you do is please share your work with us. Use the hashtag NewInfinity24. That's new Infinity 24, because we're going to follow you, we're going to repost you, we're going to promote you, and we just, more than anything else here at the factory, we want to see what you're able to do with what we've given to you. Thanks so much for being with us here at Holler & Steenbeck, and we can't wait to see what you do with our new flagship Infinity 2024. Thanks so much, everybody.